Talofa lava, malola lei, bula, kia ora tātou. Ko Brett O'Reilly, taku ingoa. My name's Brett O'Reilly, the Chief Executive of the EMA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this talanoa to discuss closing the pay gap for Pacifica. Something very dear to my heart, which I'll explain in a minute, and then I will introduce our panelists for today's talanoa. This session is brought to you by Activate Tamaki Makaurau, which is all about moving Auckland business forward. And today we're talking about really moving the Pacific community forward in Aotearoa New Zealand by closing the pay gap. Having grown up in one of New Zealand's most multicultural communities, I was a peer of many of my fellow students who were first generation children of Pacific migrants. So I grew up alongside them and saw their story unfold as my own did. And to have come so far, 60 years since I was born, and to still see the pay gap that exists for people from throughout the Pacific who call Aotearoa New Zealand home is something that we all need to do a lot about. And there are many areas that we'll canvass today where we can make a difference around this really important issue. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Activate Tamaki Makaurau for facilitating this session alongside our EMA team. There will be a Q&A with speakers at the end, so please record your questions in the chat, or feel free to just put your question when I ask for them. We are recording the webinar, and copies of the slides will be emailed out to everyone after today's session. So hopefully that will allow people to participate as much as possible. And it is really important that we keep this dialogue going. This is a really important discussion. It's a very important issue, and we welcome both your questions today, but also your feedback after the session. So I please encourage you to do that. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. And before I do that, I just have to pass on an apology from one of our speakers, our colleague Lisa Tai. Lisa and her whānau have unfortunately succumbed to COVID-19, and Lisa's not feeling particularly well at all. So our thoughts and prayers go to her and her family at this time. For those of you who know Lisa, you'll know that she's an absolute powerhouse. So it takes a lot for her to be not able to join us today. But our thoughts are with her, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to hear from Lisa at future times around this important question and issue. So firstly, I'd like to I'm going to introduce the speakers in reverse order. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Dellwyn Stuart, who is the CEO of the YWCA and someone I count as a very long-standing friend. We worked together many years ago at Telecom New Zealand, and have kept in touch ever since. Dellwyn is a leader with a track record of developing and executing transformational strategies. She was doing that back in telecom, and she's remained faithful to that cause, successfully influencing decision makers and stakeholders and finding solutions in complex and often ambiguous environments. Currently, as the CEO of YWCA, she is passionate about contributing to a future for Aotearoa New Zealand that is more equitable for all, and finds joy and optimism in her work with young women. Her career spans the commercial and not-for-profit sectors with a depth of knowledge and experience in philanthropy, fundraising, stakeholder engagement, and gender issues. Dellwyn's going to talk today, I think, particularly about Mind the Gap, something that I'm also very passionate about, and the EMA has been delighted to be part of the initial cohort of firms and organisations that have supported that mahi. So welcome, Dellwyn, and we'll look forward to talking to you later. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce is Anna Jane Edwards. Anna is the manager of Uptempo, the Southern and Western Initiative at Auckland Council. Some of you will remember that as the Southern Initiative. Now it's expanded to include the West, and Anna is an important part of that team and has been involved in that mahi pretty much from when Gail took over as CEO. So Anna, welcome today. Uptempo is a groundbreaking innovation project. It looks at how we create intergenerational wealth and well-being for the Pacifica community through workforce progression. Anna is deeply interested in how government organisations partner with different parts of the community to enable positive intergenerational social change. And that's been a big part of the Southern and Western Initiative since its inception. Her roles in public health and local government over the past 15 years have explored this concept, eventually leading her to the Southern Initiative within Auckland Council. More recently, Anna's work has focused on using economic levers such as procurement to improve well-being. Through this work, she has grown an appreciation of the important role small and medium-sized businesses play in the New Zealand economy, and has partnered with a number of businesses to test different approaches to bridging the employment gap between Pacifica and employers. And I know many of those businesses because they're members of the EMA, and I know they've really enjoyed that mahi. So congratulations on that work, Anna, and we'll look forward to talking to you shortly. Last but certainly not least is my partner in crime, Saunoamaali'i Karanina Sumeo. I've been in this job about 3.5 years, and Karanina was one of the first people I met actually when I became the CEO of the EMA, and we talked about our life experience, about my experience of working in Aotearoa New Zealand, and particularly working with the Pacifica community, and from that discussion, and I know many others that Karanina has had, came the Pacific Pay Gap inquiry and the work that we have been doing. I'm very grateful that Karanina invited me to be part of the advisory board for that project or program, which has been fascinating, and we're going to hear a lot more about that today. Karanina's professional and academic background is involved advocating for the promotion of economic development and social and employment interests of marginalised groups, particularly women, Pacific people, learners and young people. She holds qualifications in social work, social policy, mediation and science, including a PhD in public policy from AUT. The Human Rights Commission launched the Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry petition to better understand why the Pacific Pay Gap exists and how it can be closed. And we're really looking forward to hearing more about that today. To quote Karanina, it's not being Māori, Pacific, disabled or rainbow that's a disadvantage. It's a discrimination in the system that disadvantages us and treads on our dignity. We're all together today to find out more about the subject and what roles we can play in this important mahi. It's my pleasure to welcome Karanina and ask her to be our first speaker.
Whakarapalahi atu, komna Māori no ia, kirana kote katoa, nisam bolavinaka namaste, mālo lelei, mālo le soifua, mālo langi mama, tēnā koutou, good morning. Thank you very much, Brett, to EMA and to Active Tamaki for creating this opportunity. It's really significant when leaders such as yourselves, non-Pacific, use your platform and your power to lift visibility to the issues for Pacific people. So whaftaitele lava for your commitment and for walking along with us to address this. So the inquiry was launched. I exercise powers under the Human Rights Act to conduct an inquiry into what appears to be a systemic issue in terms of pay equity. We use the words pay equity, but on the ground, it means we've got 24% of Pacific children living in hardship. We've got so many people trying to make ends meet. And that's the reality of pay inequity. And everyone has the right, to equality, to fair pay, to decent work conditions, and to be free from discrimination in our workplaces. And so we are trying to understand why we have this issue. We know that there are statistics. For example, we know that very few, less than 10% of management positions across the country are occupied by Pacific people. When we compare that to our European whānau, Māori, and our Asian whānau. So progression is a huge issue. When we look at people who are working part-timers, is it because, more Pacific people work part-time? Well, actually, that's not the case. Pacific females, the least number of females who work part-time, only around 18%, compared to, say, European females, which is about 26% of women work part-time, compared to, say, our Māori sisters, around 24% work part-time, our Asian sisters, 21% work part-time. Pacific, only 18% work part-time. So we're in there, we're working, but still struggling to survive. We've seen during the COVID impact, how essential everyone is to us. And certainly many Pacific people continue to work in those essential services, in healthcare, in the provision of food, driving the buses, et cetera, sustaining our country while also exposing themselves to risks that they really could not afford to take on. So really, so that's the bad news, if I can put it that way. And then here's the opportunity, as we know. The median age for Pacific is 24%. So it's a young population compared to the general population. That's the opportunity for our country. That's the capital, that's the human capital, that's the talent, in many cases untapped, underutilized. But here's our future. Certainly in Auckland, 24% of every child in Auckland in 2018 had identified with Pacific. So one of the ethnicities was Pacific. So it's really fantastic that we're having this, because here's the opportunity for our local economy. And of course, our local economy impacts the national economy by tapping into the Pacific talent, trying to understand what the issues are. The inquiry has received submissions from over 1,000. I think we're about 1,300 people who've completed the survey. A number have been interviewed individually and giving us insights. We've also have a number of businesses. Thank you very much, Brett. And I'd also like to acknowledge our friend Rob Campbell, who's also in the background, has been helping us connect with businesses. The intention is there to help our workforce, our Pacific workforce, and to do better. Sometimes we don't quite know what to do, but certainly some of the lessons that are coming out, we wish and we will share with our business community in due course, as well as with government, as well as with our Pacific community. I want to acknowledge the work Dellwyn and the Mind the Gap group have been doing around pay transparency. That is definitely one of the barriers to the progression of Pacific people. That the simple thing of not knowing how much someone is willing to pay for your talent and for your loyalty, when you're applying for a job, and being missed for promotions. I had a really useful talk with one of our rainbow groups the other day, and one of our Fafinis was saying, well, when I give an idea when we're having a staff meeting, I don't seem to be taken seriously. If someone else gives an idea who's not Pacific and who's straight, somehow that gets noticed. So if your ideas aren't noticed and you're not recognized, you're never going to move up. So these things, and perhaps they're happening unconsciously, but it does impact, the confidence in our Pacific people. So when there are promotions, if they're not putting their hands up, try and understand why that is. Is it because they're being knocked down and ignored or not recognized? That might be something. I mean, it's great to hear the ads on the radios and, you know, different industries are going all out to attract talent. Well, Pacific talent, it might be right there in your whare, in your workplace, underutilization, you know, and tap into it. So these are, you know, we will share some of the lessons from the inquiry with you, but I will leave it there. And then perhaps when we have the Talanoa Brett up with the questions, then I can provide more examples from what Pacific workers are telling us. But thank you very much again for the opportunity, Whawhtailawa.
Malo Karanina, and thank you very much, Whawhtai, for your input and for leading this Talanoa. It's now my pleasure to ask Anna Edwards to talk to us about the initiatives that she's been leading in the south and west of Auckland Tamaki Makaurau.
Kia ora, Brett. Kia ora ana tātou kātotoa. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou i tēnei rā. Firstly, I would just like to acknowledge you, Brett. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our work. E te maraikura Saunoamaali'i. Thank you to you and your team for the incredible work that you are doing to raise the awareness around the inequity in which Pasifika face within the labour market and the important opportunity that we have as a country to improve outcomes for everyone that calls Aotearoa home. And lastly, I would like to acknowledge tangata whenua and particularly mana whenua, so Ngāti Te Ata, Waiohua, Kawerau Maki, and Tamaki Makaurau today, for which without their partnership, we wouldn't be able to do this work. And I think that's a really important part of our work in the Southern Initiative, which is a social innovation unit which sits within Auckland Council. We look at how we improve socioeconomic outcomes for South and West Aucklanders. We do that in a whole range of different ways. Uptempo is just one part of a wider team that do a whole heap of work from birth right until death. Jason is helping me with my slides today, so if you hear me say that, it's a cue to Jason to change slides for me. So change slides, please. So Uptempo is a part of the Pacific Skills Shift Initiative. We are a think and do tank in TSI. What we do is a lot of research, and then we work alongside communities to test some of the things that we have been learning about. Uptempo is a really good example of that. In 2018, we did a piece of research with MB and the Ministry for Pacific Peoples and the Ministry of Education, looking at what was happening for Pasifika people in the workforce. What we found was, and this won't come as any surprise to many people, that Pasifika were entering into the workforce in low-skilled, low-paid work, and they were staying there or around there for most of their working careers. And what we knew was that if we can increase household income into Pasifika homes in particular, we would be able to close that gap and give children under the 5 the best chance of thriving into the future. That piece of research was done in 2018. In 2019, MB picked up on the key recommendations from that report and put forward a budget bid, which was accepted in 2020, and it created $22 million new money into Auckland to focus on supporting Pasifika to improve skills and progress in the workforce, therefore improve incomes into households. If you could change slides for a second, thank you. So the key vision for Uptempo, we're a 4-year program. We are delivered in partnership with 2 other sisters, I guess. One is Project Equina, who's based in Auckland Unlimited. Many of you may have come across them because they work in partnership with employers to support their Pasifika employees to upskill and hopefully progress within their organisation or within their sector. And then the other sister organisation is the Cause Collective, who deliver matangi for all. which looks at how they support young people in particular into entrepreneurship and into digital technologies. Uptempo has a focus on families and supporting employers to look at how they take a whole of family approach to attracting, retaining and progressing Pasifika people. Our vision is thriving Pasifika peoples, leading their own futures and growing lasting intergenerational wealth and well-being. And for us, the key thing is around improving incomes. We know that there's a $17,700 gap between Pasifika and the rest of Auckland, and that improving incomes and creating wealth is probably one of the most important ways out of poverty for Pasifika. Next slide, please. We get asked this a lot. What do we mean by intergenerational wealth and well-being? We work with a small number of Pasifika employees and their families. At the moment, we have 60, and over the 4 years in which we will be learning from the program, we'll work with up to 250 ainga. In the ainga that we have right now, it's about 450 individuals. When we come to the end of the program, we'll probably have worked with about 2,500 people. And at the start, we always ask them, what are your aspirations? What do you want to see happen for you and your family? And often when we talk about creating wealth, it's not only about the individual, it's often connected to the ainga and their community and back to the Pacific. So when we are talking about improving incomes within employers in terms of salaries, what we're actually talking about is how we're lifting that whole household out of poverty and giving them more opportunity. Next slide, please, Jason. So this is another question that we get asked lots. What can we do? We're working with a number of employers who are really interested in how they support not only their existing Pasifika workforce, but attract new Pacific people into their organisation to test a good employer matrix or a maturity matrix. Over my years of working with employers in our procurement work, we've seen that we have a huge amount of people that have interest in doing this, they just don't know how to. So the matrix has been based off all of those conversations and supports people with practical tools to be able to attract, retain and progress Pasifika people into their organisation and into their sector. We are at version 3.0 and we are constantly iterating it. We've actually just partnered with Tuputoa to who will hold the Good Employer Matrix, which I should say is a holding name, to see what else it needs to be useful to employers. I would love to invite you as an employer to have a conversation with us if you're interested in seeing this. At the moment, it's completely free. And we would partner with you to see what we can actually do to improve it and document the learnings that you get from testing it alongside your existing staff and through your recruitment strategies to attract further Pasifika into the organisation. We are planning to do a next round of testing with employers over the next 5 to 6 weeks. And that journey with us usually is between 6 months to a year. So an employer comes on board, they're really keen to test the matrix. One of the key things that we do ask as a part of your journey with us is to understand the ethnic breakdown that you have within your organisation right now. And we've found that that's actually been quite difficult for employers to be able to give us that data. Often because they aren't collecting that information or that it's a voluntary thing, so you're not able to see get a clear picture of what the ethnic breakdown of your people are. So we would love to be able to test it with you starting there, understanding how you collect that data and how we can use it to inform our approach with the Good Employer Matrix. And that journey with us for up to 6 months to a year. And in the future, the Uptempo Matrix will be delivered through Tuputoa and free to all employers across New Zealand. So in terms of asks, if you are interested, we would love to be able to support you and learn alongside you around what works in attracting, retaining and progressing Pasifika through the Good Employer Matrix, but also if you have Pacific families within your organisations that you think would be a great fit for Uptempo, we are also looking for families to be able to support us. We deliver Uptempo in partnership with the Whono, a primary health organisation, and First Union. And I think I will leave it there.
Kia ora, Anna. Thank you very much for taking us through Uptempo, and congratulations on the progress that you've made. It's now my pleasure to introduce again Dellwyn Stuart from the YWCA to talk about Mind the Gap, amongst many other things, I'm sure, Dellwyn.
Thank you, Brett, and kia ora, everyone. It is wonderful to be here and to be part of this conversation with such fabulous company. Mind the Gap is a campaign that's funded by a generous Kiwi who wanted to do something that would have a significant impact for New Zealand women. And we propose that we tackle the pay gap in New Zealand and that it was ripe for another push. Many organisations and people have been working on this over the decades. We step back first of all, just a little bit out of order there we go. In October this year, the Equal Pay Act 1972 will be 50 years old. 50 years, we feel, is long enough to have waited for an act to deliver on its promise of equal pay, and sadly this piece of legislation hasn't. Pay gaps have not been moving much for about a decade now, and intersection is really important. So in 1972 the Act didn't consider tangata whenua, and it didn't take account of the many different ethnicities in New Zealand. It only focused on gender. So for 50 years we've had this act sitting there that has largely not delivered on its promise. And we really feel that we need to do better, and that sometimes these anniversaries, like the 50th one, is a good time to focus people's attention on what needs to change. So pay gaps are very much real and they persist. Every year Stats New Zealand shares the annual overall gender pay gap. That's sat around 9% for the last decade. But 9% is the overall figure. If we dive beneath that, it is much more significant for Pasifika and for Māori. So Pacific women workers earn about 27% less than Māori men. We often come across people who say, oh, well, haven't we sorted this out yet? Isn't it? It's not a real thing. It is a very, very real thing. And it is not just a number. Pay gaps are about dignity, they're about aspirations, they're about real people and real families. They're about what goes in the supermarket trolley. Sometimes I think we're caught up in the fact that it's just a number, and actually 9% is not very big. I don't think anyone could argue that 23% was not very big. We've also done quite a lot of research over recent years into trying to understand the pay gap and the causes of the pay gap. And a study at AUT showed that much of that pay gap is based on unconscious bias and discrimination. So only about 20% can be accounted for in terms of education and training and experience. The rest is unexplainable, i.e. can be attributed to the way organisations behave in their hiring and creating opportunities and paying, rewarding their staff. The solution is very much in our hands. And what we know is that pay gap reporting works. Overseas, we're probably about a decade behind the countries that we usually like to compare ourselves to, that being Australia, the UK, many of the European countries, even the US and some states. In many of these countries, pay gap reporting has been a requirement of businesses for over a decade. They have shown that it can work. So an example is that in the UK, initial reporting showed that 92% of organisations had gender pay gaps, and that just the introduction of gender pay gap reporting reduced that gap initially by 19%. That is a significant gain just simply in the reporting of pay gaps. So we know it works. We know that once employers know and understand their pay gap, that they start to work to address them. And in fact, you can't address this without doing the analysis and understanding if you have a pay gap. Many organisations, in fact, most organisations think that they don't have a pay gap when they haven't done the analysis. And certainly most don't set out to have a pay gap or to pay women or to pay Māori or Pacifica women less, or to trap them into low-paying role. But experience shows that when companies do look and they do find pay gaps, that A, they're quite surprised they have them, and B, they're very motivated to fix them. So the introduction of pay gap reporting is not the whole answer to our needs here, but it's a really vital first step. You can't fix a problem until you know it. And always brings to mind the old saying that sunlight is in fact the best disinfectant. So in March this year, the campaign launched New Zealand's first pay gap registry. And we were really pleased to launch with more than 50 organisations publicly reporting their pay gap. So they're doing the measurement and they're sharing that and making it transparent. And that transparency is really important. And in the tight labour market we currently exist in, and the very strong desire talent have to work somewhere that is honest and transparent, making your pay gaps transparent is really vital. And organisations report to us that they're not punished for reporting a large pay gap. They're celebrated for saying, yes, we understand we have a pay gap and we want to fix it and we will work towards fixing it. Of those 50 plus businesses that are on the pay gap registry, sadly only 7 were reporting Māori or Pacific pay gaps. And I think this reflects the climate that that 1972 Act created when it only focused on gender and it didn't look to ethnicity. The real gains are to be made in addressing the Māori and Pacific pay gap. We'd love to have more organisations on the registry voluntarily. We hope to have at least 100 by the 50th anniversary of the Act in late October. The campaign's also drafted some policy advice and has been working with government to encourage them to set up a framework of pay gap reporting to make it as easy as possible for businesses to do. And initially, what we've recommended is that it's for employers of more than 50 people. And that's largely because we've got 5,000 organisations in New Zealand that employ more than 50 people. And the analysis at this level of staff protects people's privacy. There will be a solution for smaller organisations, and we are working on some diagnostic tools to help those with less employees. We've suggested that organisations need to report annually, but they need to submit their reporting to a body. To make it easier, it would probably be someone like NZ Stats or MB, who businesses are already engaged with. That we need a standard methodology and definitions. That's really important. And again, that it does need to be publicly available. And we would like to see the government require New Zealand organisations to do this. And we're really heartened by bodies such as Business New Zealand and the Chartered Accountants of New Zealand and Australia, who say, well, actually, pay gap reporting is a modern business performance tool, and it is something that we want to see organisations do. So to summarise, it's a really vital first step towards pay transparency, and we hope part of a package of initiatives that we see business adopt in New Zealand. We know it's low risk for businesses. We're already seeing it become normalised. And it's really important that the private sector businesses are on the same level as our public sector businesses, who are now required to report. We can be world leading in this if we adopt pay gap reporting for ethnicities. No one in the world is yet doing it. The UK and America are both in discussions on looking at doing it. But we're a small, nimble organisation who used to be at the front on gender-related issues, and we could be once again if we step into the very vital space of resolving pay gaps for Māori and Pacifica. It will put money into wallets that need it. It will make a difference to families' aspirations and their well-being. It means that we will be creating a better future, and it is something that I think is a perfectly reasonable expectation 50 years on from a line in the sand around equal pay. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dellwyn, Anna, and Saunoamaali'i, Karanina, Sumeo for those initial addresses. It really, I think, contributes beautifully to the talanoa that we want to have today. Can I encourage everybody to use the chat for questions? And I see we've got some questions and comments already started. But Dellwyn, I'm going to kick off with one for you. One of the when we're discussing the gender pay gap issue with employers, one of the, I guess, the frequently raised issues that we hear is the impact that maternity leave has on the pay gap. And I know it's something you and I have talked about before, but I'd be really keen just to get your view on this talanoa about that, because we know that from the demographics that the fastest growing population in New Zealand is Māori and Pacifica, and we definitely need more rangatahi in New Zealand. So we don't want to discourage people from having whānau, but I'd be just interested in your views on this, because I know you've looked at some of the data.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. One of the result. There are complex issues at play here and quite embedded systems. And one of those is that in New Zealand, when we welcome a baby into our household, it's still the norm for the woman to take parental leave rather than the man. I think it's something like, of 300,000 people who take parental leave each year, it's only 3,000 that are the fathers. And I think as organisations, we can do a lot to encourage new fathers to take that time off with their children. And there might be ways that the government can support that too, in a use it and lose it targeted approach to parental leave, or organisations really encouraging dads to take that time out. So that is an important part of this, and it has a big impact on women's earnings, and that in turn has a big impact on women's retirement savings as well. So it's definitely something that we need to be tackling hand in hand.
Thanks, Dellwyn. I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that despite a lot of the progress that society has made, that that those stereotypes still exist, at this point. You know, are there any other mitigations that businesses could think of? I know I'm just reading an interesting article over the weekend about more businesses, you know, in the US particularly, as are trying to attract and retain staff, offering childcare facilities. You know, I guess trying to be more inclusive of that. You know, of I guess a holistic level around how they embrace the families of their staff. Obviously, a lot of their businesses are much larger than businesses in Aotearoa New Zealand. But you know, what are some of the other things that businesses could think about in that space?
Yeah, I think something that springs to mind is just the kind of gendered nature of the conversations that we have in workplaces about families and supporting families. We're still directing those questions around childcare and what provision is required to the women in organisations and not to the men. And I think it's a great role for men to be allies to greater equality and stepping forward and talking about their experiences of childcare and what they need for childcare, and not just leaving that conversation to be between the employer and the women that work in the organisation, as a really simple thing.
Thanks, Dellwyn. Any other comments from our other panelists?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the support with childcare, you know, would be, I mean, it's one of the things that I think is quite fundamental. And, you know, I was a parent myself, and it's something I see now in people in our team at Human Rights Commission. So many of them have little ones. So, and offer to subsidize or pay for the childcare would really support our women to be able to come back to work. And I'm not in any way saying that staying home to raise a child is worth less than being at work. I'm not saying that at all. And the other thing, while people are on leave, you know, if there's training that's going on, you know, so many of our jobs now we've learned can be done from home if you're lucky enough to be able to do that. If there are learning, upskilling opportunities that come up in the period of time that someone's away, you know, that's another opportunity for them to be able to link in and engage in online learning, so that they do upskill while if they're able to build that in, so that they don't come back after 6 months or a year and things have moved on without them. You know, quite simple things like that, because then of course that helps to retain your talent and not lose them if someone else makes them an offer while they're on leave, things like that. Yeah.
Anna, would you like to add to that, Talanoa?
No, I think that Dellwyn and Saunoamaali'i have really summed that up nicely.
Fantastic. Well, I've got a question from Yana, which I think actually is at the heart of many of the discussions we've been having around the pay gap. How much do opportunities for professional development and in-work upskilling affect the pay gap? And a second part of that question, and how can organisations do this better for Māori and Pacifica in this space? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to start if you like.
Anna.
It's really important. What we're finding is that when you support people to upskill, and it's kind of a mixture of two things, transferable skills and skill-specific skills. When that mix is right, people progress quickly and have that taste of what progression looks like, and therefore take further opportunities to progress in their careers. What we are finding is that it's deeply complex in terms of getting that balance right. The right type of pedagogy in terms of adult learning needs to be applied for Māori and Pasifika to succeed in that, that learning, and that first experience of learning is the most important thing. So what we've heard from employers lots is, we've got all of these opportunities to upskill, but none of our Pasifika people are taking it. Why is that? And so our response to that is, you need to ask them. A lot of them have not had a good experience of the education system to date. And when they say no, you need to unpack that and continue to ask, because that's when you start to get to the bottom of what actually is happening. And often it's a fear of engaging in learning and failing again. So we've been working alongside Māori and Pasifika private training establishments who are really great at doing this, to develop short micro-credentials that enable people to have a successful experience of learning, stacking them so that they are learning a number of new skills, and increasing bandwidth and opportunity for themselves. And those skills are then being applied back at home as well. So you're not only getting a better employee, they are making more money, those skills are transferring back home, they have more bandwidth to engage with their children, they're able to do other things that they love rather than work 70-hour weeks. And as a result of that, our children are starting to thrive. So it's super important.
Mm. Yeah. What we're seeing from the inquiries is that there's sometimes there's a difference in being receptive to taking opportunities depending on the generation. So we're finding that some of our first settlers, if I can just describe our elders, they're a bit scared of the computer. They're quite comfortable doing what they've been doing for the last 20 years. And so the sense of confidence, and some of it links back to what you're saying, Anna, if the experience hasn't been positive, it takes a lot to try and say that this is for you too. Learning isn't just for young people. If you look at manufacturing, the nature of work is changing. If you want to continue working for the next 5 or 10 years, the job is changing. It's trying to explain those things. So what we're hearing in the context of COVID, and we're hearing this from healthcare, workers in healthcare and in manufacturing also, is the short staff has meant that even when they put their hand up training, they're not released to go to training. And I've also heard this from the police. So it's right across, and it seems to be, in the views of people who speak to us, it seems to be tempting for their bosses to look at Pacific people to be the ones who will always then cover for others. I don't know whether they're more resilient or, they're more relaxed about it, but it just seems to be that they go to Pacific first as the option to take, to cover for the gap, and therefore they lose out on the training opportunities, but they don't also get remunerated for the extra work that they're having to do. So that's something for our businesses to take on board. The other thing that's coming across to be sometimes perhaps more useful is targeted mentoring or sponsorship of a Pacific worker in an organization. So we can all attend training programs, but what makes a difference is if a senior, someone with some position of authority and influence, takes it upon themselves to sponsor, informally or formally, a Pacific person, someone that they're seeing, has lots of potential to do other things, then that really counts. And I can speak from experience that that's happened in my life, and my mentor has not been a Pacific person because not many Pacific people are in those roles. We do need, and that's why today's really significant, Dellwyn and Brett, you know, your voices, because you are the people in power. So we need people in power to help lift our brothers and sisters up and create that opportunity and take risks with that talent. But I'm pretty sure no one would take a risk if they didn't see the talent is there. So those are some of the things that we're hearing through the inquiry.
Whawhatai. Dellwyn.
Yeah, if I can just echo what Anna said about, you know, you do actually have to sometimes ask people and tap them on the shoulder and encourage them. But also what I hear from young Pacific women is that it's so important to them that when they enter a workplace, that they can bring their whole self and that they are seen and valued in a holistic way. And once they have that sense of really belonging, their confidence in taking on opportunities grows hugely. It's certainly not about a lack of potential and talent there, but it's about being fully seen and recognized.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key points that you know I've taken out of your talanoa on this aspect of it. First, I think we've seen and Karanina talked about manufacturing. A lot of our focus with upskilling is on young people, and that's obviously really important. But there are a lot of people in the workforce who are not digital natives, don't have those digital skills, and so often just the aspect of perhaps having to use a digital device, and this isn't a unique thing to Pacifica and Māori. This is across the workforce where they are reluctant to, you know, to do more advanced learning because increasingly it's blended and it's online. So with the Skills Shift program that we were involved with at Buckley Systems, that was really just about giving their workers confidence about using a digital device, which enabled them to then start taking on more productivity, and then in turn starting to really become much more confident in a learning environment, because we know that vocational learning is a pathway to higher skills and to higher incomes, and we all aspire for that for our workers. I think the other thing I was involved, as some of you will know, in the establishment board for what is now Te Pukenga, and there still is an inconsistency around what we used to call pastoral care, what I prefer to call whakawhanaungatanga, but how we actually support our learners. And I think, you know, that those examples where, and I've seen it firsthand in other organisations that I've had the opportunity to be involved with, where, you know, organisations with the best intentions have wanted interns or a more diverse workplace, but haven't always had the systems and the processes in place and the culture to be able to allow those young people to thrive. It's something we've been talking about around, you know, how we as an organisation, the EMA, and as part of that Business New Zealand family, can help in that process, because a lot of our organisations in Aotearoa New Zealand are small. They may not have a dedicated people and capability manager or a learning manager. So what can we do to support, to support the intent, which I think is often there, but often that execution doesn't match the intent. So I think that's a role that all of our organisations can play in that process. And there are definitely some great case studies of organisations that do that really well, and doing maybe a better job of promoting some of those case studies would help. I'm sure we can all think of employers that do that well, and not all of them are large.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be great if that can be something that come out of the inquiry, but we're just finding it really hard to reach people. And because of COVID, we weren't able to really do the outreach and find some of those good examples, but I'm sure that they're. The other thing that's also coming out of the inquiry is the number of Pacific people who are on contracts. And that is a big barrier, of course, to progression. The healthcare worker who spoke to me, she's been on contract with the same provider for 6 years. So, it doesn't make sense to me if if she was good enough for them to keep employing for 6 years, why don't they just offer a permanent job and then invest in her? And that's not an isolated story, you know. Different. So how we see our contractors, especially in this climate, if people have been dedicated and still been working with you, and Pacific people, you know, have told us stories of being very loyal to, because you develop friendships and you know the business, and you know, and it's like your job. But consider offering them a job, and then invest in their training, and give them some security. The impact will be huge, but you will gain someone who's already experienced in your business. So contractors, how we see contractors, and how we invest in them, that requires some rethinking if we're going to hold on to this talent. And thank you.
That's a great provocation. Anna, I've got a question here from Joy Sapelli. Joy, thank you for this question, because it is something that it's one of my hot topics. Joy's question is, funding models for NGOs make it impossible to close pay gaps for Pacific team members. You know, we cannot compete with mainstream organisations. And one of my hot topics is, you know, too often we see government funding not tied to pay outcomes. And I think particularly in the transport sector, where there's a lot of commentary about the low wages paid to bus drivers, and yet that's been an issue for at least the decade that I've been aware of it, and yet we still don't see minimum pay requirements included in those government procured contracts. Anna, what can we be doing in this space?
One of the things that we did with a contract in partnership with Auckland Transport a few years ago was pull together. There's an abundance of support out there, and often we've heard from employers they don't know how to access any of it or what exists, because it's all in silos. So when we were looking at what types of quality employment outcomes we'd put into those contracts, we also attached what types of support is available, so that those that were going for that work were able to find exactly where opportunities to partner and to get funding would be. And I think that's a super important part of this conversation too. There are places where we can get support. It's just not accessible and managed in a way that is packageable for employers and or not-for-profits. Now, what I am not saying is that there aren't any gaps in that, but by being able to leverage the existing supports in a better way, we're able to identify those gaps and focus efforts into getting funding into those spaces. And I think that's a really good example of that, that Joy has brought up, in terms of not being able to compete with mainstream not-for-profits, not being able to compete with with mainstream organisations. So the first thing in my mind would be to be able to connect all of the different support that is available right now with the people that need it, and then through that be able to show that there are some clear gaps that need to be funded better to enable some parity.
Anna, just speaking from the EMA's perspective and the other Activate Tamaki Makaurau partners, well, we'd be very keen to be a conduit for that information. You know, I think, you know, we know that, you know, often there are schemes out there, but people just are not aware of them, and particularly smaller businesses, it's really hard to find the time to do that research. So if we can help in that way, we'd be more than happy to push that out through the Activate Tamaki Makaurau community and through other communication mediums that we have, to try and make sure that people are making informed decisions in that space. I've got a question here, and I might pose this to you, Saunoamaali'i. The question is from Liki Mataafa, which is keen to understand where the pay gap exists, whether it's primary industries or manufacturing. Are there stats around which niches the pay gap exists in?
Well, so far, there is no business place that we've come across that does not have a pay gap. So it exists everywhere, to put it quite simply, whether we're looking in the public sector or parts of the private sector that we've been able to look into. So that's the very simple answer. And the gap varies.
Oh, we might have a little pause there.
So, yeah.
Oh, we lost you for a second there, Saunoamaali'i. Can I just get you to cover that last part again?
Yes.
Thank you.
So because it's everywhere, that's why we launched the inquiry, because it appears we have a systemic inequity, which is a violation of fundamental human rights and a violation of our own rights. As Dellwyn has said, we've had this equal pay for 50 years and we're not equal. We rave about how great we are in terms of gender pay gap, 9%. Actually, if you measure our progress through the eyes of Pacific and Māori women, we've got nothing to rave about. We should be ashamed of ourselves. So it's everywhere, unfortunately, sister, and we need to work to do something about it. Okay, that's a quick answer to that question.
I would just add that it absolutely is everywhere. We found that too, and yes, there might be different reasons in different sectors or in different businesses that cause it, but it is universal. And yes, we should be ashamed of it.
Well, look, I think that's a very sobering but very appropriate sentiment to finish on. I think I'd like to thank our speakers today for this talanoa, for their input, to Anna Jane Edwards, Saunoamaali'i, Karanina, Sumeo, and to Dellwyn Stuart. Thank you so much for your insights. This will not be the last time we get together and discuss this issue. This needs to be an ongoing talanoa that we're having across the Pacific community, the Māori, women, any area in our workforce where we see inequity. It's our role to try and close those gaps and close them fast, because there's no reason why this needs to continue in the way that it has over a long period of time, and we're very committed to that process from the EMA's perspective, and I know the other Activate Tamaki Makaurau partners are as well. So thank you for your insights today. Thank you to all of those people in our audience who have tuned in, for the questions that you've asked. Please, if there are additional questions, put them in the chat. You'll be getting a copy of the today's webinar and the presentations. I encourage you to reach out to our speakers. They are experts in their fields, and the more data that we have, the more informed decisions that we make. And that can be qualitative or quantitative, but it all helps with shaping this really important area for the future of Aotearoa New Zealand. So thank you everybody again for joining this Activate Tamaki Makaurau session. Thank you to Susan A, Deborah and Jason for their expert guidance behind the scenes. And we'll look forward to talking with all of you again in the future.
I love it. So thank
you, everyone.